This is my dog, Jenny. Isn't she cute? She's so cute. She has a tumor disorder. So you can't see it here, but she is the lumpiest thing. She's got a lump the size of a softball sticking out of her side. It's just, it's like lipoma. So we're not going to traumatize her by removing them. And now I've grown kind of fond of them. She's just my lumpy dog. Anyone around for the rainstorm this past Sunday? Yeah. I mean, that kind of felt like a waterfall dropped on Flower Mound, Argyle, Highland Village, and Louisville, and just torrential rain. We left my dog outside. Had I known that we were going to have like a reenactment of the flood in Noah's Day, I wouldn't have let my dog go outside, because my dog if she loves one thing, she loves mud. And we're driving back, and I knew what I was in for, so I didn't even pass go. I went right upstairs, and I started the tub, and our house is our dog's house. We love our dog. We are such dog people. She's my dog, so she loves me best. She is an inside dog. Like, we don't tend to leave her outside for long stretches. But when she is covered in filth like that, she is ceremoniously unclean for the Carrell household. It's not that she's not welcome, it's that she's not welcome in her present state, because she would soil my couches and my rugs, and then she would be subject to the wrath of Rebecca, which is not pretty, so say my children. And so it's not that she's not welcome back, it's just that we have to go through a few steps. There is a ceremonial cleaning that has to take place before she can be welcomed back into the Carrell fold. As you know, the book of Leviticus is the book of worship. It sits at the heart and center of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and I hypothesize that is because worship is at the heart and center of the Jews' relationship with Yahweh, and it's at the heart and center of our relationship with Christ. It teaches the Jewish people, the book of Leviticus teaches the Jewish people how to live with a holy God in their midst. And the key to this is holiness. So if you were only allowed to choose one theme for Leviticus, and thank goodness we're not limited to one because there's quite a few, but if you could only pick one, it would have to be holiness. The book of Leviticus spends more time on holiness than any other book in the Bible. I think you could add them all up, and they still don't spend as much time on holiness as the book of Leviticus does. It's the overarching theme. God is a holy God. The Jews were a sinful people, but God is ruthlessly determined to dwell in the midst of his sinful people. And so he gave them, as an act of grace and on the foundation of love, he gave them the sacrificial system so that they could receive atonement, and he gave them the laws so that they could know where their boundaries are, which is actually quite kind, and so that they could live in right relationship with God and right relationship with others. When some of you know that I spent 23 years in radio. The last 10 of those were at a Christian station, 90.9 KCBI. And when I first took that job, it was like in increments. So at first I was just sort of a sometimes fill-in, and then I would fill in for longer chunks, and they were like, hey, how'd you like to do the morning show? And I remember that first week, I was given no instruction, okay? And I had 13 years of major market experience behind me, so perhaps they didn't think I needed much. And the only way I ever knew I did something wrong was when I saw our general manager come running down the hall, and his face was really red, and he had this vein that would squeak, right? Okay, so actually, like, boundaries are very kind. And there can never be a relationship without boundaries. We have to know what's on and off limits for each other. So before we even get into it, I want to present this to you. The very fact that God even gave us laws is a gracious act of kindness. And we talked about this the first night if you were there. None of us want to live in a lawless society, right? We might think we do, but then anyone who's seen anything in the Purge franchise knows that's not a good idea. You haven't, and I'm really glad. That's very sanctified of you. My kids like those movies, and they're too old for me to like be judging now. They're one's in college, and so when they watch them, I'm just like, I've given up. But anyway, a lawless society is a disaster. So, in the book of Leviticus, holiness is determined by two things. The first is ritual purity, and then the second one is obedience. And I'm really actually glad that we're going to spend some time talking about holiness tonight, because I think we're kind of far removed from this concept in 21st century America. Church used to be considered a very holy, sacred place, and you would walk into these great, some of you grew up maybe in a Catholic or some kind of cathedral tradition, and you walked in and there was just sort of this air of reverence. And then in the mid-70s, the seeker-sensitive movement began, and the goal was to make church not feel like church and to kind of tone down the awe and reverence so that the intentions were really good, so that we could widen the funnel to bring more people in. And we did that. But what religious scholars are finding today, 45 years later, 45, 50 years later, is that what's happened is that our degree of holiness has dropped significantly. And that is in part, I think, can be traced back to the seeker-sensitive movement. I think it's also in part due to just the overall secularization of our society. But once upon a time, it was common to wear our Sunday best. Once upon a time, when we had discourse in the public square, we were very polite. Even if we didn't like someone, even if we didn't agree with someone, we could have conversations with people, and it would not resort to name calling. It would not resort to, you see those videos about the Karens, and, I've got a really good friend. I've got two really good friends named Karen, so I hate to even say that. But our holiness bar has dropped substantially. But here's the thing, God's hasn't. God's holiness standard has not moved even 1 inch. A.W. Tozer has the quintessential book on knowing God. It's called The Knowledge of the Holy. If you haven't read it, I recommend it so highly. In it, he writes this: God's holiness is not simply the best we know, infinitely bettered. We know nothing like the divine holiness. It stands apart, unique, unapproachable, incomprehensible, and unattainable. The natural man is blind to it. He may fear God's power and admire his wisdom, but his holiness he cannot imagine. God is the absolute quintessence of moral excellence, infinitely perfect in righteousness, purity, rectitude, and incomprehensible holiness. And in all this, he is uncreated, self-sufficient, and beyond the power of human thought to conceive or human speech to utter. Holy is the way God is. To be holy, he does not conform to a standard, he is that standard. He is absolutely holy with an infinite, incomprehensible fullness of purity that is incapable of being other than it is. Because he is holy, his attributes are holy. That is, whatever we think of as belonging to God must be thought of as holy. God is holy and has made holiness the moral condition necessary to the health of his universe. To the health of his universe. Since temporary presence in the world only accents this, whatever is holy is healthy. Evil is a moral sickness that must end ultimately in death. And we're actually invited into that. We're actually invited into that. In lesson 1, when we talked about God's creative intent, I gave you that big seminary word, perichoresis, which is just like the divine love dance of the three persons of the Trinity who are diverse in unity but cannot be separated. And I showed you what it was like. My friend Nika says this. It's like you got the three people of the Trinity and it's all like, I love you more. No, I love you more. No, I love you more. No, I love you more. I mean, it's just this infinite overflow of love that we are actually invited to. And holiness is the ticket in. Where am I? Okay, so in other words, if Israel is going to dwell with God in their midst, they have to become holy. Now, one of the things that makes this book complex is because we read the laws of holiness, we read the holiness code, and we're like, I see it, but why? Right? I mean, that is such a fair question to ask. We are 3,000 plus years removed from this culture. It does not make a lick of sense to us. Some of it does, but a lot of it doesn't. Like, why is one animal clean and another unclean? Why do you have to tear down a house because there's a funky spot on a wall? Why does your period, something none of us signed up for, all right? None of us signed up for that. Why does that keep us from entering God's sacred space? That doesn't feel fair. And honestly, why did God place such tight restrictions around sex? That doesn't feel fair. That doesn't feel fair. And more often than not, Moses is simply not going to answer our question in a way that would satisfy us. More often than not, we're going to get something like this. For I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy. Here's why. For I am holy. Be holy as I am holy appears 5 times in the whole book as a direct command. The words I am the Lord, which is making a covenant statement, appears 49 times in Leviticus, more than in any other book. And each time it's given as a reason for a set of commands or regulations. So in other words, we might look at some of these laws and we're like, but why, Lord? But why? And God's just like, because I said so, and I made you, and I'm kind of holding you together and pumping breath out of your, like because he's God. And every now and then to our stubborn and rebellious children, they can't conceive why we're making them do something. We just have to tell them it's because I'm your mother and I know best. I'm your mother and I know best. So as we get started, let's remind ourselves of Israel's role in the ancient Near East because this gives us the right paradigm for understanding God's laws. Exodus 19:6 said, the Lord speaking, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And last week we talked about the role of the priest. It's to represent God to the people and represent the people to God. So the priest actually stands between two parties and acts as a mediator. So why did God want Israel to be a holy nation? It was so they could mediate on behalf of the pagan nations. Remember, this was an evangelistic mission. This is God sending out missionaries all across the world. And he wanted Israel to mediate God's blessing to the pagan nations. In Genesis 12, God told Abraham that through Abraham's offspring, all nations would be blessed. And that blessing was to be mediated through Israel. Now, if they were going to stand on behalf of the nations to God, so if they were going to stand in the presence of God, they had to be holy. They couldn't enter that space in a state of ritual impurity. And if they were going to represent God to the people, well, they couldn't look like the people, right? They couldn't be partaking in their pagan ritual rites, right? We talked about some of those last week. If you didn't get to hear that, I think you want to go back and listen to Baal and Moloch worship. And I'm only going to say those things once in church. I'm not going to say them twice. It's on the tape. But they had to fairly represent God to the people. They had to stand as God's representatives. So here's what we're going to attempt to cover tonight. This is so much information, and I apologize because I really should have insisted on teaching this 5 nights, and I didn't, so we're stuck with 4. Okay, chapter 11 is concerning clean and unclean animals. Chapter 12 concerns purification after childbirth. Chapters 13 and 14, we're going to spend a little time on it because there's just so much there. These are regulations surrounding leprosy. And then chapter 15, I know you are on the edge of your seats to talk about bodily discharges. We're going there. We're going all the way there. We are not going to get to chapter 17 tonight. I'm going to add that next week when we talk about the Day of Atonement with chapter 16. It just flows better that way. We are going to spend a little bit of time in chapter 18 talking about the laws regarding sexuality. And I hope to give us there, what I hope to do is give us some nuance to approach conversations. So that's my goal there. It's certainly not to beat anyone down. Chapters 19 and 20, various laws and punishment. Chapters 21 and 22, we will spend almost no time there. Holiness and the priests. So bring your questions when we're done. Okay, so we're going to start with chapter 11, clean and unclean animals. These are loosely broken into 4 categories. You have the land animals, the water animals, then you have the flying creatures, which include bugs, and you also have the swarming things that swarm on the ground. that phrase just tickled me, the swarming things that swarm. So these are the 4 things. Now, got a little Genesis hyperlink here because these are in the same groups in which God created on days 5 and 6. And there is a little nugget there, but I don't know that we'll have time to get to it. So if you want to, you can ask me about it later. Okay, so we're going to start in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, this is that little literary marker that we are starting a new speech. Speak to the people of Israel, so this is for everyone, saying, these are the living things that you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. So we are getting into dietary laws. Whatever parts the hoof and is cloven-footed and chews the cud, among the animals you may eat. Nevertheless, among those that chew the cud or part the hoof, you shall not eat these. The camel, I know you're disappointed. So sorry. Actually, we're in Christ, so you can eat all the camel you want. Because it chews the cud and it does not part the hoof, it is unclean to you. The rock badger. There goes Thanksgiving. Because it chews the cud but does not part the, I'm sorry, I'm being a stinker, is unclean to you. And the hare, because it chews the cud. Did y'all know that? That a hare chews that? You knew that, Lori? You didn't know that? I didn't know that. Like I totally did not know big rabbits were cud chewers. Anyway, it makes it unclean. The pig, because it parts the hoof and is cloven-footed but does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. You may not eat any of their flesh, and you shall not touch their carcasses. They're unclean to you. Okay, so this is where we can ask questions like, why? I think that's a really good question. You have probably heard various theories circulating about why some animals are clean and some animals are not. There are about 6, I think, maybe 7. The one most of you have probably heard, it's the most common, is the hygiene hypothesis. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Yeah, so basically, God in his foresight knew that pork carried rotavirus, and this carried this, and this carried this, and he was like, I'm just gonna help you all out in my sovereign foresight, and I am going to protect you from eating things that are bad from you, and I have sectioned off this group of animals that you may eat. I adamantly believe that is not true. It sounds really good, but I think this is very easily disproven, and all we have to do is go to Acts. In Acts chapter 10, we are introduced to a Roman man named Cornelius. He is described as a devout man who, along with his whole household, worshiped the Lord. Cornelius sees a vision of an angel who tells him to send men to Joppa and fetch Peter. In the meantime, Peter is on the roof of a house. He's very hungry, and he falls into a trance-like state. And in this trance-like state, he sees a vision 3 times. In this vision, he sees like a sheet being lowered. I'll just read the text. Acts 10, verses 11 through 15. Peter fell into a trance and saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet descending, being led down by its 4 corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, by no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. So that is our little clue, that these are all common or unclean animals. And a voice came to him a second time, what God has made clean, do not call uncommon. So if God was protecting the Jews in a hygienic sense, it makes no sense to me that he would revoke that later. So I think what's going on here is that there is a theological reason that some animals are considered clean and some animals are considered unclean. And we definitely, in these verses, we have a big old hyperlink to Genesis 1. I'm going to show it to you. So if you think about what's going on in Leviticus 11, what God is doing is he is dividing, right? He is separating things, right? He is separating clean from unclean, and we are actually going to see that pattern throughout leprosy, throughout bodily discharges, throughout, I know you're so excited for the discharges, you're just gonna have to wait, and for the laws. God is dividing. Leviticus 11, 46 through 47, I want you to see these verses. This is the law about beast and bird and every living creature that moves through the waters and every creature that swarms on the ground, to make a distinction, okay, between the unclean and the clean, and between the living creature that may be eaten and the living creature that may not be eaten. The words "to make a distinction" is just one word in Hebrew. It's badal. Badal. This is a direct hyperlink to the creation story. Genesis 1:14, and God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to badal, to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years." So essentially what's going on here is Moses is very deliberately casting our minds back to Genesis 1. Why? Because we are in the middle of a new creation story. This is a new creation story. And just as he divided light and dark and earth and water and day and night and seasons in Genesis 1, so he is making divisions for his new people, his kingdom of priests. That's the birth narrative that we're in now. This is the birth of Israel as a kingdom of priests. And so this is a creation story. Now, what was the very first law that God gave to Adam and Eve? What did it concern? Food. Yeah, it was a dietary law. And you'll notice when you look through this first section of clean and unclean animals, the ones that God declared clean are the ones that they are to sacrifice. So if you think of, you've got a kingdom of priests, the priest's job is to be a God representative, literally an image of God. He is to be the God ambassador to the pagan nations. What is he doing? He is imitating God to them. He is being the God ambassador on earth, and he does what God does, and he eats what God eats, and he engages in what God says is acceptable. This is a high and holy privilege. This is such a high and holy privilege. Okay, so that is my theory, and I'm not the only one. This is a rather well-known theory, but that is what I really think is going on here. I don't think it has a lick to do with hygiene. All of us, or at least probably half of us, like shellfish, So yeah, I don't think it has anything to do with that. Okay, we're gonna skip ahead to chapter 12, which discusses impurity after childbirth. Leviticus 12, 1 through 5, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the people of Israel saying, if a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As at the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying." So that is a total of 40 days. "She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks," or 2 sevens, "as in her menstruation. And she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days. So that is 2 40s, 2 sets of 40s there. So a woman is made unclean from menstrual blood and childbirth. So the first thing that I want to establish is uncleanliness and sinfulness different. Okay, if you read through this carefully, and I hope you do, you will see that there are so so many things that rendered people unclean that they had literally no control over. Like, y'all, we can't control it whether or not we get a runny nose. We can't control, so there's just so many things. So we can't look at this as a sin delineation. Now, does sin render you ritually impure? Yes, it does. However, you can be unclean and not be in sin. Okay, so that's the first thing I want you to see. The other thing I want to address is the length of days a woman is considered unclean. Did anybody wonder about that? Yes. Was that going to be one of your questions if I didn't address it? Well, I wondered about it too, and I spent a lot of time on this. 1 week for a male, 2 weeks for a female. That's her state of uncleanness. Then she'll be in a state of purification, 33 days for a male, 66 for a female. So we get to ask why. What is going on? And I'm like, God, do you like boys better than girls? Because that's kind of how I feel, right? And I think it's okay to feel that way. But I don't think that's at all what's going on. Not even close. Think back to Genesis 1 and 2. God made both men and women in his image. We are full image bearers, and we do not have to be married to be an image bearer of God. We are not less a person if we aren't attached to a man. We are full image bearers in our own right. And in Genesis 2, God made Adam and Eve priests, both of them. Okay? What did God say when he saw the man in his alone state? It was the first time he declared something not good. Right. Okay. And what was God's solution? To make a helpmate suitable. And if you are a King James person, a helpmeet. Okay. These are the Hebrew words eitzer kenedgo. It is essential that we understand these words. It is essential. Okay. Ezer kenedgo. Eitzer means help. Kenedgo means alongside. Traditionally, Ezer kenedgo has been translated as helpmate suitable, and that is a terrible translation. Eitzer is usually used to describe someone who rushes to someone's aid when they are in dire straits. One person cannot handle something on themselves. They must have help, and another strong person comes to their aid, and together they can do the task. Almost every time that we see Eitzer in the Old Testament, we are seeing it in warfare language, in a military context. And do you know who the number one Eitzer is in the Old Testament? God himself. So any image any of us have of a helpmeet suitable, just kind of running around and making meals and darning socks and what do you need me to do, honey? No. Eitzer kenedgo was a compatible ally. One of my favorite Hebrew scholars translates that word as sustainer. This is war image. And a man cannot do his task without his compatible ally, without his sustainer. There is nothing weak or inferior about women in a biblical sense. Not one little thing. Okay, where are we? I said that. Okay, yes. So there's nothing in the biblical text that would ever give us reason to think that women are inferior, God likes women less. No, woman was the crowning moment of his creation. It was not good for the man to be alone. Okay, so I want to pose a question about this. When we read this text in Leviticus, longer to be away from the temple or tabernacle when there's a female, why do we read that as negative? Because we all did. We all felt kind of slighted by it. I've given birth twice. Both times I was working full time. Both times I had 2 months off. I didn't want to go anywhere after 7 days. I don't know about you. I didn't want to go anywhere. I didn't want to go anywhere after 7 weeks. I was so exhausted. And if you've had biological children, you were too. What if This is a gift to women. What if this is carved out time off? I mean, if you've read about the Proverbs 31 woman, you know she was not sitting in her tent eating bonbons and watching the Jewish version of Oprah. Like, she worked. She legit worked. She had muscles. She worked physical manual labor. Everyone did. Everyone did. So I don't think we're supposed to take this as a negative. I think we're supposed to take this as a gift of God being merciful. Theologically, women, it was thought in the Jewish mindset that a man had all of the offspring he would ever have in him before he ever had an offspring. So a rabbi would say Jesus was in Abraham, and he would mean literally in Abraham. His seed was in Abraham. And along the same lines, a woman was thought to have all of her menstrual discharge in her at the time of her birth. Now, actually, we know that's true. You do have all of your eggs at the time of your birth. But I think a more rational reading of the text is that a woman got an extra week off because she was unclean on behalf of her discharge and unclean on behalf of her daughter's discharge. So she got a bonus week of rest. She had 33 days of purification for herself and 33 days of purification on behalf of her daughter. So she got an extra month plus off. I'm telling y'all, childbirth was brutal. It was the number one cause of death among women, still is, around the world. But in biblical times, it was the number one cause of death among, and you had no epidurals, you had nothing. It was 100% natural. And so I think this was a gift. I think this is a mercy. Okay, so let's keep going. If you carefully read through the laws of uncleanliness, you'll notice something. So for both men and women, because these discharges, I think I moved us into discharges now. No, I didn't. Okay. But for men and women, their bodily discharges, semen for men, menstrual blood for women, these were discharges connected with life. The temple was a place of life. The thing that rendered you most unclean was death. This is why the priests couldn't touch a dead body. And so I believe, and there's scholarship to back this up, that the reason you had to stay out of the tabernacle or the holy space when a man had an emission of semen or a woman was on her menstrual period, because that was considered life spilled. Okay, that was life that didn't result in life. It resulted in death only because it didn't result in life. And so that is the ritual impurity law, keeping, because God is a God of life. We were never supposed to die. That's not why we were created. And so death is not supposed to enter the tabernacle unless it's a purifying death like the sacrifice. Okay. Chapters 13 and 14 deal with leprosy. Okay, leprosy is kind of a bad translation, and it dates back to the King James, and even I think a translation before that. It comes from the Latin. And so when we hear leprosy, we think of Hansen's disease. This was not Hansen's disease. They were not dealing with Hansen's disease. There is a whole lot of doubt as to whether or not Hansen's disease was even in existence during that time period. So across the board, scholars pretty much agree that this is like a catch-all term for psoriasis and eczema, dermatitis, ringworm, rosacea, any kind of rash. It could be an allergic reaction. And if you had, I get bumps on my arms when I'm super stressed. And they're just crazy itchy. And if I scratch them even once, then they erupt and it's horrible. That would have rendered me unclean and caused me to be outside of the camp. So I don't think we're supposed to have Hansen's disease in mind, modern day leprosy. There is more said about skin disease than any other health condition in Scripture. by far. And more time is spent on the laws concerning leprosy than any other kind of law. So if you think back to Genesis 3, I think there is a theological implication here. If you think back to Genesis 3, you have Adam and Eve, and they ate the fruit, and then all of a sudden they realized something. What did they realize? They were naked, right? Okay, so here's what happened. They ate the fruit, and all of a sudden, their eyes were opened, and they saw each other's flesh. They beheld each other's flesh. They saw each other's nakedness, and they were ashamed. It had to do with skin. There is a theological connection between sin, skin, and living outside of God's people. Living outside of God's presence. One scholar that I really love did a really good lecture on this. I'm talking about the theology of our bodies. So we are made in the image of God, and that is body, soul, heart, spirit, mind, all of it. Our whole self is made in the image of God, but our bodies also hold up the image of sin. And we know this because we are deteriorating, right? Like my hair is not getting blonder by itself, all right? There's a little bit of effort and chemical manipulation that goes into that. I feel like I was a long distance runner for years, so my knees are expired. They are just expired. They have exceeded the warranty. And, so we feel the weight of decay and death of the curse on our bodies all the time. In the biblical mind, there was a very close association with sin and skin disease. And there are several instances in Scripture where divine judgment resulted in a skin disease. Miriam, Moses' sister, is one of them. Now, the Levitical laws, so in those cases, it was a divine judgment. Now, the Levitical laws are not making a divine judgment or a moral judgment. And just because someone had a skin disease does not mean that that person had sinned. They probably hadn't. But these skin diseases are a type. They're a picture of the horror of sin and the consequences of sin. So the horror of sin is that spiritually it is just utterly disfiguring. It completely mars the image of God that is in us. It makes us spiritually unfit to enter into God's presence, and it renders us sent outside the camp. Where did Adam and Eve have to go after they sinned by eating the fruit? Outside the garden, which is outside the camp. It is outside of God's sacred space. Okay, so we're going to read through 8 verses of Leviticus 13, and I think that more than makes the point. So starting in verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons, the priests. And the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of the body. And if the hair in the diseased area has turned white, and the disease appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a case of leprous disease. When the priest has examined him, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if the spot is white in the skin of his body and appears no deeper than the skin, and if the hair in it has not turned white, the priest shall shut up the diseased person for 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day. And if in his eyes the disease is checked and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall shut him up for another 7 days. And the priest shall examine him again on the 7th day. And if the diseased area has faded and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only an eruption. And he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the eruption spreads on the skin, after he has shown himself to the priest for his cleansing, he shall appear again before the priest, and the priest shall look. And if the eruption has spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous disease. Okay, so then verses 9 through 46, it is long, go through all of the various type of skin irritations. These can be swellings in the skin, open wounds, a boil, burns, an itch that manifests on the head or the face, a leukoderma, I don't even know what that is, or a deep skin ailment on the head. This was taken very seriously, and this was dreaded among the people. Leviticus 13:45 through 46 says, the leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. Okay, this is grief. This is mourning attire. So he's supposed to dress as a mourner. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Okay, this is heartbreaking. And this is like one of those verses where I'm like, I don't like it, Lord. I just don't like it. I don't like that this is how the way they treated the diseased. But there are a few things that are worth pointing out. First of all, when you compare the way the Israelites treated skin diseases or contagions to the way the pagan nations did, this is actually very compassionate. All right, yes, they are cut off, but they are not without a lifeline. The priest keeps going back and forth in and outside of the camp. Josephus is a Jewish scholar who lived 37 to 100 AD. He wrote about an Egyptian king who ruled from 722 to 715 BC. His name was Bakcherus. When Bakcherus learned of a group of lepers living in his kingdom, he had them gathered up, there were hundreds of them, wrapped in sheets of lead and drowned. So in comparison, it's like super horrible to our sensibilities, but it was actually kind of compassionate back in their day and time. Second, this was a protective measure. So one of the primary jobs of the priests was to guard the holiness of the camp and the holiness of the people. And so the infected person had to go outside the camp. Why? To protect the people. And all I could think when I was kind of like meditating on this was, oh my gosh, Yahweh is the God who casts out the one to protect the 99. He casts out the one to protect the 99. And third, I referenced this earlier, they were not alone. The word priest is mentioned in this chapter 51 times. 51 times. And in the verses that I read to you, it's so weird because like in the rest of Leviticus, in places where the author could have used a pronoun and just said he did. But in Leviticus, he doesn't use, or in chapter 13, he like does not use the pronouns very much. Instead, it's the priest, the priest, the priest, the priest, the priest, the priest, the priest. And it would have caught their attention because normally he would have interspersed that with pronouns and said he, but he didn't. And it's deliberate. So the priest is to represent God to the people. And he was constantly going back and forth outside the camp. He had a ministry outside the camp. It was believed, and certainly it would have been the priest who was bringing food, bringing provisions, sitting with them, just being with them. And so there was pastoral care in this. And Jesus is all over this. And so then I was like, Lord, not only are you the one who sends the one out to protect the 99, but in that same act, you are the one that goes to the one to bring him back to the 99, because that is the heart of God. I love how often the gospel authors called attention to Jesus' ministry to lepers. And he like glommed himself all over them. He did not hold back. He took their hands, he touched their face, and then he said, go and show yourself to the priest. He did not leave them cast out. Why? Because his heart is always to bring the one outside the gate back in. Man, I love that. I love that. He protects his people like so completely, so sufficiently. And at the same time, he has a bleeding heart for the one we need to be protected from. Isn't that awesome? Oh, that's why I love this book so much. Okay, all right, I know we got to keep going. There's so much material. Okay, The word used to describe skin disease is the exact same word used to describe like a mold on a garment or on a piece of their wall. And so essentially it's all repeated language. It was treated the exact same way. 7 days, quarantine, go back and check, cut the piece out, check. If it didn't spread, then you're fine. It spread, burn it down. So that's essentially chapter 14. Actually, that's the back half of 13. Okay, chapter 14 deals with the extensive cleaning process. We're not going to go through it. I'll let you read that on your own, but you will notice that the ritual purification for leprosy is like 3 times as much for anything else. And I think there's a reason for that. One reason, I believe, is it reassured the community. Like, it's actually okay for us to insist that we see fruit of change before we welcome someone back in. Like, that's not negative. That's not negative. Skin diseases were absolutely devastating in the ancient world. The prolonged process was sufficient proof to the community so that this person could be fully embraced. There wouldn't be any of this, so glad you're back, good to see you, y'all be over here. There was none of that. They were to be fully embraced back into communal worship. This concept of being outside the camp, I think, is still very relevant. When a person is sinned against grievously, and someone is jailed, all right? There has to be sufficient time spent making reparations, right? Most of you, I think if not all of you, know my story. I am 15 years sober. I spent 2 years making amends, and I knew that just because I listed my offenses and asked for forgiveness, I knew that person still needed to see fruit of a changed life. And that is good, and that is right. We are not right to ever pressure someone into quick forgiveness and restoration. We are not called to do that. We are called to forgive, but quick forgiveness is super cheap. And then that person is just going to have to continue to process it for years to come. So this gives us permission to say, I need to see evidence of a changed life before I open myself back up to you. Now, once we are required to bring them back into sisterhood and brotherhood. And there are other times and places where I think people feel like they are outside the camp. I moved every 3 years of my life growing up. I always felt like I lived on the fringe. I love the people who went out of their way to make me feel like I was one of them. That is a gift and a ministry. Deep grief makes us feel separate from people. If you've lost a loved one, you know how isolating it is. That's another instance where we can be very deliberate in going to them and sitting with them, and then when they are ready, holding their hand as they come back into the area, moving to a new area, visiting a church. But if we are to be a kingdom of priests, and Peter says we are, then we need to always be looking for ways we can bring people who are outside of the camp back into the camp. Okay, who's ready for discharges? It's really not that exciting. I'm just having fun saying that in church. Okay. I know I'm a stinker. Male abnormal discharges. They are lumped into 4 groups. Here we are. I made you a nice little slide. I want you to notice the chiastic structure. I just think it's fun. It's a little literary device we've got male abnormal, male normal, female abnormal. A chiasm is a literary device where you go A, B, B, A. Or A, B, C, C, B, A. And what that's doing is it's emphasizing a mid-stress. So we tend to emphasize an end stress. We say the most important point last because we want people to remember it. They are a chiasm says, hey, the most important material or the material that this is centered around is in the middle. I don't know if it has a ton of significance other than discharges are normal and they don't make you sinful. So abnormal discharges for a male would have been a sexually transmitted disease. It would have been something like gonorrhea. A normal discharge would be after sex with his wife or a nocturnal emission. Female normal discharges would be menstrual blood. Female abnormal discharge could be, think of the bleeding woman that grabbed Jesus's cloak. It could also be a sexually transmitted disease. But what you'll notice is that the discharges have to do with sex or sexual organs. So This is going to be important when we talk about the laws in chapter 18. Sex in pagan religions was seen as a ritual act. End of story. It was a ritual act. And if you were here last week when we talked about Baal worship, it was an act of worship, okay? It was also for procreation, but they kind of had a funky idea about how women were impregnated. So I don't 100% know they got it. I do believe they did, but I'm not willing to die on that hill. And because God was setting Israel apart as a kingdom of priests, they had to be ritually cleansed after intercourse or a sex-related emission before they could enter the holy space, because other pagan religions would have sex in their sacred space. That was a part of their temple worship. And so there could be none of that because God's sacred space is holy and set apart. So that's really it. That's not that big of a deal. It required a ritual cleansing and then a burnt and a sin offering. And I know one of you is probably going to say, why did that need a sin offering? I don't know. I think it's because we're just sinners. I think sin is viewed as an infestation and a condition of the heart in ancient biblical thought, and not necessarily specific acts all the time. It was specific acts, but in this ritual context, I think it was just a statement on human brokenness and human fallenness. Okay, we're skipping chapters 16 and 17. We'll do that next week, so we're going to skip over to chapter 18, and these are the laws around sex. Verse 1, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived. So we know there was pagan ritual sex going on there. And you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. So debauchery on all sides. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. So this is sort of a preamble to the rest of Leviticus that deals with laws. This isn't just prepping us for the laws around sex. It's prepping us for all the laws that come in chapters 19 and 20. I want you to notice in those verses that Yahweh, Lord spelled with all caps, is mentioned 4 times in 6 verses. That's very significant. Why the repetition? By using his covenant name, God is reminding the people of their special status as his chosen people. And as his chosen people, this is a privilege. This is prominence. This is a high position. And so they are to be set apart. Not separated, but set apart. It's different. Okay, so Jesus actually builds on this premise in the New Testament. Matthew 5:14 through 16, he says, you are the light of the world, which, by the way, I don't know if I've already said this. After you're done studying Leviticus, read the Sermon on the Mount. It's just a Bible study on Leviticus. It's fabulous. But Jesus says, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand. And it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so they may see your good works, not you, your good works, and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So the point of Leviticus and the point of the Sermon on the Mount is that God's people are supposed to stand out. We are never supposed to assimilate. We are not supposed to blend in. And that just means as children of privilege, there are some things that are not becoming to children of the king, right? Okay, so we're not going to go through all the laws, but we're going to look at one that's pretty darn interesting. Leviticus 18, 6 through 10. None of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether brought up in the family or in another home. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. The euphemism for sex. And if you look at the New Living Translation, the NIV, the CSB, the HCSB, they all translate it as do not have sexual relations with, is a better translation. But it's interesting, the verbiage uncover the nakedness, that appears somewhere else. Does anybody know where else that appears? It's a bizarre little verse that Noah, we're going there. Genesis 9, 20 through 25. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the vine, that's supposed to say vine, sorry, and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, that's an interesting detail because he doesn't have any children yet, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan." That's weird. It was Ham that Canaan. All right. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Ham was the one who looked on his father's nakedness. And in Leviticus 20:17 maybe, or 7, it says to see someone's nakedness is also a sex act. So there is something fishy going on here. And it's really fishy that Noah didn't curse Ham. He cursed a son that wasn't born yet. My working theory, and the Bible Project guys agree with me. Actually, I agree with them. They're so much smarter than I am. Is that Ham had sex with his mother, and she became pregnant with Canaan. Now, I can't prove it, but I don't see a whole lot of other options that make a whole lot of sense. And also, the Hebrew in this Genesis passage is tricky. But there's no question there's some kind of shady sex act going on here. And I think the very fact that he cursed Canaan is very suspicious and might suggest that Ham got his mother pregnant. I'm not the only person in the world who thinks that. That is my working theory. Moses then addresses all forms of incest, adultery, homosexual sex, bestiality, and I want to talk about the language that he uses because I don't like to let elephants sit in rooms unaddressed. And I also think there are too many skeptics who take these passages out of context and try to give Christianity a black eye. So I want to address this very delicately, but also very honestly. There are two words to describe homosexuality and bestiality. They're called an abomination and a perversion. The word translated to abomination means faulty, corrupt, or polluted. The word translated to perversion can be translated as confusion, a violation of nature, or a violation of divine order. The thrust of those words is not, "Ooh, get that person away from me." It is, "Oh my goodness, look at the brokenness. Oh my goodness, what can we do?" This is the heartbeat in this. Is that something has gone very wrong, and God's created order has fractured. So the things that fall into the category of abomination and perversion are things that go against God's ordained natural order at creation. Okay? In other words, they are the things that God instated for the health of the universe. And when something inhibits the health of his universe or human flourishing, that's when those two words are called in. It's more of a state of deep grief and brokenness. Okay, so that's super, super important. What did God do at the beginning? He spoke order out of chaos. He ordered the cosmos. He ordered the earth. He ordered everything in it. He drew limits around the seasons. He drew a line in the sand for the sea. He established the man and the woman to work the garden and keep it. In other words, to keep the order for its flourishing. And then he commissioned the man and the woman to be fruitful and multiply for the health of the universe and for the flourishing of God's image bearers. So God's intended purpose for sex is not ritual. It's never been ritual. It's not recreation either. Although recreation is not off limits within God's ordained boundaries, but it's procreation. And so actually it is an act of obedience somehow for a man and a woman to come together in the most intimate relationship. It's not disobedience if they can't have children. All right? That's not sin or disobedience or a sign that you are under a curse at all. But it is part of God's ordained creative order that man and woman will share that in the deepest, most intimate way of knowing. When Adam knew his wife, that's the Hebrew word yada, and that is the word for the most intimate form of knowing that there is. It's a knowledge with no secrets, essentially. So how do we talk about this? Leviticus 18 through 24 through 30 reminds us that what we are dealing with is ritual purification in these verses, okay? It says, 18 verse 24 says, "Do not make yourself unclean by any of these things, for by all these nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants." That's why God was sending Israel in to purge the land of its iniquity and to purify the land through their obedience and sacrifices. "But you shall keep my statutes and my rules and do none of these abominations. Either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you, or the people of the land who were before you, did all of these abominations so that the land became unclean." He is talking about ritual sexual acts, sex in temple spaces. "Lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For everyone who does any of these abominations," read ritual sexual acts, "the persons who does them shall be cut off from among their people. So keep my charge never to practice any of these abominable customs that were practiced before you, and never to make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord." I also really truly believe that there was a protection for God's people around these verses. I don't know if any of y'all have spent much time with victims of incest. I actually have. And it's devastating. And if you have been a victim of sexual assault, I know that that is the wound that keeps on wounding. That is a wound that your body and your brain forces you to relive at inopportune times over and over and over and over. And without health, I know that that feels like a death sentence. And so I think one of the reasons that there is such harsh language around incest and some of these acts, the recipients of those ritual sexual acts, the recipients of the acts, not the perpetrators of the acts, were victims. They were kids, animals, for crying out loud. They were victims, and God has a heart for the victim. And so I think that this is an especially beautiful passage for victims of abuse. It shows just how seriously God takes it. And if you look, we're not going to get there tonight, but if you look at the punishments surrounding those things, you were done. You were stoned. You were cut off. You were cast out. If you were the perpetrator, not the recipient. If you were the perpetrator. And so that is just, I think sometimes we get so caught up in reminding ourselves that God is a God of mercy and forgiveness and grace that we forget that it's actually amazing and comforting that God is a God of justice too. And that like when someone wounds God's people, Jesus says things like, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Not my church, not my people." When Isaiah in chapter 53 says he bore our iniquities and by his stripes we are healed, when someone's raped, Jesus is raped. When someone's robbed, Jesus is robbed. When someone is a victim of something so horrific they can't talk about it, it happened to Jesus. Why? Because you're his body. And that's super comforting for me. And I want that to be comforting to you. And so actually, I think these are passages that need to be taught. And I'm not going to shy away from them. They do not ever need to be used out of context to marginalize a people group that's already marginalized, ever. That's wrong too. But these are comforting passages given in their proper context. Okay, so I also want to, when we are listing things that are grievous to the Lord, I want to point out that there is one verse in all of this, one verse that addresses homosexuality. All of the rest of the verses are about incest, adultery, and one verse about bestiality. That sex was not supposed to happen out of a monogamous marriage was assumed. The Gospels don't mention homosexual sex. They do mention sexual perversion. Homosexuality would be included. Paul only mentions it 3 times. So contrary to that, I want you to think about just how much time the biblical authors spend on, hey, love your neighbor. Hey, give to the poor. Hey, seek justice for the widow and the oppressed and the orphaned. Hey, don't be greedy. Hey, be generous with your whole life. Way more ink is spilled on those things. Way more ink. Another thing to remember is that these were not laws for people who weren't Israel. Like, this is limited to God's holy covenant people. And honestly, like, the same is true for us. The same is true for us. And so before we ever enter into a heated discussion, I want to remember that it's not good practice to impose a Christian worldview on a non-Christian. Why would we expect them to behave to a law code that's not for them? That doesn't make any sense. I'm not required to submit to the dress code of the Middle East. Those aren't my laws. Why would someone enforce that on me? That's not going to work. Certainly not going to soften me to them. And so in thinking of our role as priests and our desire to reach groups outside of the camp, let's just think of ways that we can nuance these dialogues. Because I think that we need to approach these conversations with utmost compassion, utmost love, utmost grace. And remember that God seems to spend a lot more time worried about whether or not we're loving our neighbor and whether or not we're generous and helping the mistreated and the poor and the oppressed. Those seem to be his primary concerns. Okay. We got to stop. Okay. So chapter 19 is an expansion of the 10 Commandments. I just want to call out a few that I think are really beautiful. This is what I do when I Bible study. I literally print out a copy of the whole book and I scribble all over it so I don't get distracted by the notes. And it's very helpful to me. Okay, so this is kind of an expansion. Chapter 19 is an expansion of the 10 Commandments, but I love this. This is God's heart for the poor. When you reap the harvest of your land, this is verse 9, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, and neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so a woman named Sandy Richter wrote a stellar book called Stewards of Eden. And in it, she calculated how much they would get from one pass-through of the average harvest and just how much hungry days the average Israelite would have each year because they were sustenance farmers. So they had on average 60-some hungry days a year. And knowing that they would have 60-some hungry days a year of food insecurity, they were only allowed to take one pass through their fields or their vineyards. This would leave a tremendous amount of fruit for the poor, like 10 bushels, if not more. And then in the book of Ruth, you see Boaz telling his workers to throw some of those sheaves on the ground, leave a little bit of extra. So this is actually a faith, this is a test of faith that they could trust God to provide. And I also think it's worth noting, and this is a conviction for me, that God has always had a plan to care for the poor in place. And it's always been through those who have enough. It's biblical obedience for us to give to those who are in need. It's actually a biblical requirement. And I just think that is so beautiful. And I think this is such a picture of what the new heaven and the new earth will look like when everyone has enough. And when you have a bumper crop, you're not going to be like, look how much I can save for next year. You're going to be like, oh my gosh, who can I share with? Come here, let's have a huge feast. It's going to be so much fun. I'm going to slaughter 2 calves. Let's eat all the meat. I think our deepest joy in our eternal state is going to be generosity, because everything God has ever done has been an act of divine generosity. And I think we get to participate in that when we act generously today. And I think that's one of the fastest ways to partake in the joy of the Trinity, is to live generously. Let's see here. Okay, last few things. Chapter 20 is punishments for disobedience. Chapter 22, holiness instructions for the priests. I am going to answer all of your questions, but I want to end the lesson with another A.W. Tozer quote, because I think this is so beautiful. He says, before the uncreated fire of God's holiness, angels veil their faces. Yea, the heavens are not clean, and the stars are not pure in his sight. No honest man can say, I am holy, but neither is any honest man willing to ignore the solemn words of the inspired writer, follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man can see the Lord. Caught in this dilemma, what are we Christians to do? We must, like Moses, cover ourselves with faith and humility while we steal a quick look at the God whom no man can see and live. The broken and the contrite heart he will not despise. We must hide our unholiness in the wounds of Christ, as Moses hid himself in the cleft of the rock while the glory of the Lord passed by. We must take refuge from God in God. Above all, we must believe that God sees us as perfect in his Son, while he disciplines and chastens and purges us, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Holiness is for the health of the universe, the flourishing of humankind, and you know what? It is your soul's greatest longing. It is your soul's greatest longing. Every hurt, every heartache, every sorrow, every sadness, every loss is an indictment against sin and a heart shriek to be put back in right relationship with our Eitzer Kenetgo, our sustainer, the God of the universe. Isn't that glorious? Isn't that just awesome? Okay, I'll pray at the end. Let's go ahead and hit me with your questions.